Okay, so we'll go through these two exercises on the topics that I've just been talking about. So first of all, make the verb agree with the noun. Okay, so all you have to do obviously is say which of these verb forms is correct. So there is or there are people waiting. Okay, so the first one should be very easy. The word people is a bit of a troublesome word, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Generally speaking, we use the word people as a plural of person, right? So we would say there are people waiting, okay? So the first one, the answer will be are, the second possibility. Whereas number two, ours is a great people. No, okay? So in the second example, we're talking about a people, meaning a nation, a society, something like that. So we have to be a little bit careful with people. Now, normally when you're learning, you're told that we don't use the word person in the plural. So when we want to talk about more than one person, we say people. That's generally true, but not completely true. The word person can be used in the plural, and again, in legal, more formal English, it very often is. You may see a sign on a bus that will say something like 10 persons standing only, or something like that. Um, you might find the word persons, I don't know, in a police report or something like that. 3 persons were standing outside the pub. So the word person does exist in the plural, but usually we use the word people. But the word people itself is also a singular, meaning, as I said, a nation or a society of people. Okay, so you just, obviously the first version is more common. Normally we say there are people, but we can talk about a people which is. Okay. Okay, then we've got two examples about institutions, and you can probably guess that these two examples don't work in the same way. So the police has or have a difficult job to do. Well, the police are always plural. We always say the police have a difficult job to do. I don't know if that's because they go around in pairs all the time, uh, but for some reason, the police are always considered to be plural. We say the police are coming, okay? If you say the police is, well, again, it is possible you could say something like, but normally it's with another noun. So you say the police force or the police service is underfunded or is very corrupt or something like that. Um, Whereas when we say the police are, we are, as I said before, talking about the individuals. So when we talk about what particular policemen are doing, we're always talking about the individuals who make up the police force. Okay. It doesn't work the same way with the army, however. So we would say the army is always prepared for action. Okay. The army being treated as an institution. If you were to use the plural verb with army, this would again have the same sense of referring to individual soldiers, but this is very unusual and would have a sort of comic effect. Okay, if you have two or three friends who are soldiers, you might, when they arrive, at your flat, you might say, "Aha, the army are here." It's possible, okay, but it's not very common. Possibly this is because armies are usually divided into smaller units. So someone who's in the army might say the regiment are prepared, meaning the soldiers in the regiment, or the regiment is prepared. But the army itself as a whole is generally treated as an institution and takes a singular noun. Okay. Okay, number 5, linguistics has or have developed a lot recently. Linguistics is one of the academic subjects which ends in S, but is singular. So its linguistics has developed a lot recently. Okay, so there are similar things like economics, politics. These subjects are singular forms. Okay, they are not plurals. There is one exception to this, which is number 6. The acoustics here. So acoustics taken as an academic subject or as a scientific subject would be a singular. However, in normal usage, where people are simply referring to the way in which sound works in a particular room, people generally use the plural. So they would say the acoustics here are excellent. If you were studying to be a, I don't know, sound engineer or something, and you had a course on acoustics, then you would say acoustics is my favorite subject. But in everyday use, to describe, as I said, the way sound is in a room, we talk about the acoustics are excellent. Okay. Number 7, bacteria, causes or cause disease. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about foreign plurals in English. Maybe I ought to talk about it a little bit. Bacteria is a plural form of bacterium. Okay, probably not many of you have studied Latin. People generally don't these days, but this is a typical plural form. You don't need to know about foreign plurals in English in order to do this course, although it might be something that is worth learning if you want to use English at more advanced levels. Generally speaking, any Latin noun which ends ium will then take ia in the plural. The problem is that usage in English is a little irregular. So in the past, the plural of stadium was always stadia, but now more and more people say stadiums. So it's a little difficult to tell you exactly what you ought to be doing because it's kind of changing. People don't learn Latin anymore, so they're not so familiar with the Latin endings. However, there are several, and generally speaking, in English, unlike in Polish, when we take foreign words, they take quite a long time to be adapted, and sometimes never really become fully adapted to English. So certain words in the plural will use the foreign plural rather than the English plural. Obviously, over time, eventually the S gets used as the plural, but not always straight away. So, for example, French words which have X at the end in the plural, like gâteau, will also have X in English. And there are other examples, but I don't think there's any need for us to go into that in detail. Now, if anybody's interested, you can ask me to talk about that more. Okay, the thing is that there are certain words which are almost always used in the plural. So bacteria is one. We don't very often talk about one bacterium, although we could do. Another one which is very important for you in terms of study is the word data. Okay, so data also is a plural of datum. Okay, so technically one item of data is a datum. Generally, in everyday life, people talk about data as though it were a singular form and say data is. Yeah, so the data is not clear. Scientists are more likely to say the data are. But so it's generally only in scientific situations that you would actually use what is the correct form, which would be the data are. So if we come back to our example, bacteria, technically it should be bacteria cause disease, okay? Because bacteria is a plural of bacterium. However, you can imagine that it would be quite likely for native speakers of English to say bacteria causes disease simply because they don't think of bacteria as a plural. They think of bacteria just as a phenomenon of this thing which is in the world, rather than as a collection of smaller things which are each one a bacterium. Okay, so it should be bacteria cause disease, but don't be surprised to hear people say causes. Okay. One of the things you'll notice is that these rules are not rules which you can give to people and tell them that they're doing it right or wrong. These rules are simply out of use, and as use changes, also so does the rule. Okay. Number 8, the old folk doesn't or don't know anything about the internet. Okay. Folk is another interesting word in English. Obviously, this is linked to the German word. Um, Here, folk is being used as a plural, so we would say the old folk don't know anything about the internet. Folk here is working just like the word people. Okay. So here it takes the plural verb. However, um, it gets a little bit confusing. In America especially, they use the word folks quite a lot with the plural form. Okay, whereas in English, so in British English, sorry, British English to me is English, American English is something else. But okay, in British English, when we say folks, this can only really mean parents, whereas in America, folks can just mean people. So that can be a little bit confusing. The folk can also mean people in this sort of kind of traditional sense. So we talk about folk music, folklore, uh, whereas old folk is a sort of set expression just meaning old people. So this word can be a little bit confusing. As I said, in Britain, your folks usually means your parents, whereas in America, folks is just can just be people. It can also mean parents, but it can also just mean people. Um, so there is a sense in which you could say the folk doesn't, if you mean the people. Okay, although this sounds a little odd and is not I think very common. Uh, so you can pluralize folk to folks. So we can't say that folk is a plural necessarily. However, it works as a plural in sentences such as this. Okay, moving on to the second exercise. And here I make it explicit in the exercise to use the correct or better genitive, s or of. So I want to make it clear that in many cases it's really the better genitive rather than the fact that one is right and one is wrong. Okay. So in the example, John has a brother, so this person is John's brother. Okay. If you were to say he is the brother of John, you would sound rather silly. Okay. Unless, and this is where it all gets a little bit complicated, unless John happens to be a king or happens to be, for example, the writer of a gospel, in which case the amount of dignity which this person has and the respect given to this person would make it much more likely that you would use of. Okay. So what of does is it distances things, and genitive s brings things closer and makes them more familiar. Okay, so normally in life we would say John's brother, unless John is somebody very, very special. So if we look at some of the examples, so Shakespeare wrote plays. So these plays we could describe as Shakespeare's plays, or we can describe as the plays of Shakespeare. So again, Shakespeare is certainly a person, so it makes sense to say Shakespeare's plays. However, if we want to give a lot of respect to Shakespeare, then we might well say the plays or the works of Shakespeare. And if you read, if you see on the back of a book, a collection of Shakespeare's work, very often you'll find that the of is used. Okay, so if you want to make Shakespeare sound greater, then you can use the of. If you want to make him sound more familiar and closer to you, you use genitive s. Okay, Sophocles also wrote plays, but Sophocles gives us a couple of reasons to be careful. So first of all, Sophocles clearly ends with s, and not just with s, but with the sound es. So to say Sophocles's is a little unpleasant. And likely to be avoided. And also, Sophocles going back much further in history than Shakespeare is a more distant figure. So it makes much more sense to say the plays of Sophocles, or the works of Sophocles. Sophocles' plays doesn't sound very good, both, as I said, for simply the sound of the word and also the fact that he's a very distant figure. Okay, so this will be true of many different figures. Obviously, a lot of classical figures will have names that end in this way. Another very good example and a very difficult example is the name Jesus. Okay, so we might say the disciples of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. However, in more modern church practice, there is a desire to make Jesus seem closer to people and not so much a distant authority figure, which might lead people to want to say Jesus's disciples, Jesus's teachings, which is possible, right? So it's not that it's wrong. Some people might say, well, that's less respectful, but at the same time, that Jesus is supposed to be somebody who's close to you if you're a Christian, rather than this distant authority figure. So there can be a different effect depending on which genitive you use. Okay. Example number 4, so we're moving away from people now. The ship has a siren. Since the ship is an object, you would expect that the better answer would be the siren of the ship. However, you would be wrong. The reason being that ships are not objects. In the English language, ships are women. So this is an example of a noun which has a sort of hidden gender. Ships are always referred to as she. Names of ships are if they have any kind of traditional type name, like a person's name, then they're always female. Okay, obviously warships are a little different, but warships, even though they have, even if they have an aggressive sounding name, they're always referred to as a she. Okay, so we would say the ship's siren, the ship's captain. Okay, of course, there might be instances where the ship was being thought of in a very impersonal sort of way, and then it was used with of, but the crew of the ship and people connected with the ship would always think of it as it's thought of as a kind of mother for them while they're out on the sea. So it's always referred to as a female and therefore as a person. Whereas the siren made a noise. Okay. Here with this, I maybe should have been more careful with the example. Siren obviously could refer to a mythical figure as well, but we're thinking just of siren as an alarm here. So the siren made a noise. So the siren is not, it's part of the ship, but it is not a person itself. So it will be the noise of the siren. Okay, number 6, the school has a history. So as I said before, if we're talking about the school as an institution, okay, then we will say the history of the school. But if we want to think about the school as a collection of people, okay, then we might say the school's history. Personally, I think the history of the school sounds a little better, but there might be reasons for using the S here to stress that it's a collection of people, but normally you would say the history of the school. And finally, the book has pages. So ordinarily we would say the pages of the book. Okay. However, the reason that this example is here is that sometimes with very short words like book, it just seems to be easier just to stick the S on the end. So I can say the book's pages are stuck together or something like that. With familiar items, short names, short nouns like book, there is a tendency sometimes to use the genitive S, although again, the general rule is that for an object like that, we should be using of. Okay. I'm sorry if some of those answers seem to be, well, it could be like this, it could be like that. It's up to you. But that, I'm afraid, is the nature of language. Okay. What's important is that you understand that there are different ways of making the genitive, and you understand that there are some differences in how you will be understood depending on which you choose. Okay. There are options. There are stylistic options. The meaning is generally the same, but there can be reasons to go one way or the other. Okay. And as I've said a few times, right, that the use of language does not follow the rules of descriptive grammar. The rules of descriptive grammar try to keep up with the use of language. Okay. As usual, if there are any questions about that, please get in touch with me. But for now, that will be the end of lecture 2.